So, do you see my stream, I hope? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Just to introduce myself and maybe Camilla quickly, we are, as Eric said, in the central team, we are much more in the area of glass business, which can make sense on the daylight and visual comfort in building. You will see just after. So just to start on this interesting topic, please do not hesitate to put your question in the chat. Of course, we will keep some time at the end to answer. So visual comfort, delight. So first, this is the agenda, mainly four parts. We do the first one and the last one. Camilla will go much more on maybe the technical part. So we will share together the presentation. So what do we talk about? We talk about natural daylight or natural light. In the perception of everybody, everybody enjoy this kind of I would say a sensation to have a lot of natural light. And the question is maybe much more to express it on a more, I would say, formal or factual way. So this is the purpose of this introduction. At the moment, clearly, we spend most of our time out of daylight or not so exposed, because today we can say that we spend, let's say, more than 90% of our time indoors. This come back on the key question to have or not access to this natural light on a clever way. Why this natural light is so important for the human, or in general all the species that are living on the earth. It is linked to this, I would say, internal clock that now most of everybody knows, I think, or you probably heard about, linked to the circadian cycle. There was a Nobel Prize in 2017 on this circadian cycle. So this is also why there is much more interest on this. To make the story short and to try to explain, this cycle is more or less a 24-hour cycle on which our brain is synchronized on. And this synchronization on this cycle of the sun, more or less, and give a lot of impact on our, I would say, behavior, and also some physiological behavior of our human bodies. So, for example, you have, of course, you have some management of melatonin secretion. This is probably one of the most well-known topic linked to the circadian cycle. There are also other impact like I would say sleep, or our cycle to sleep cycle. There is also some other, I would say, blood or physiological impact. But all in all, keep in mind that this 24-hour, I would say, cycle is very important to keep, to have a human being, let's say, working on a good way. This is the point. And if it doesn't work, or if you lose this synchronization, there are several examples of, let's say, some disease. Of course, there are some issue on the sleep. There are some issue on the stress, probably also well known and documented. And also you can go up to some, I would say, diseases which are much more health, like there are some examples, but still to be probably confirmed about cancer, and or I would say cardiovascular disorder, as it explained. But more or less, this is this loss of synchronization on the circadian cycle can have some impact on our well-being and also our health. This is something which is now largely proved. These light benefits are also, since I would say a few years, I would say 10 to 15 years, there are also some documented example and quantification about the benefit on our, I would say, daily activity. So there are some example on the productivity, the learning capacity, how to recover if you are in some health issue. There is a lot of benefit. We can come back after. This infography you have here is probably one of the most known. It is the World GBC infography, which is now almost 10 years old. But this demonstrates that now there is more and more quantification on the real impact of the daylight. To go a little bit more in detail in this introduction, we can now, let's say, try to structure or to consolidate the benefit you can have in different type of building. I will separate the non-residential segment, mainly the big building, the office building, the hospital, and maybe also the retail building, and see what are the potential benefits. So for office building, of course, the workplace productivity is one of the impact and the measured KPI, if I can say. The daylight have some impact on the good mood you can have, and also the way to minimize the stress you can have in your daily job. The health, of course, I will come back on this, but yes, the recovery and the way also to learn in school is something on which there is a lot of documentation. And last one is probably something that is now raising more and more. It is the way to maybe better manage the energy saving. And also, in some extent, and we have an example, how to increase some sales in some, I would say, retail shops and so on. So to go in detail, here you have some more documented and quantified, I would say, example. In school, you have a better test score and you have a better learning. This is something which is now proved. In office, this productivity is more or less established, I would say. Some impact on the absenteeism, if I can say, and also probably a better mood and a better also recovery with better sleep all in general. And in hospitals, probably this is something on which they will have more and more focus due to the current I would say context, because you have the recovery of the hospital occupant, if I can say, but also the way also to minimize the staff, I would say, fatigue. I don't know if it's the right way to say it in hospitals, because it's the well-being of the occupant, the hospital occupant, is in general well improved. An example, interesting example on the retail and the efficiency of the impact, I would say, of daylight in retails is shown here. It was done on stores in US, and to explain, the idea is was to demonstrate on stores which were more or less comparable in the same district. The impact between stores that were equipped with skylight and some other that were not equipped. And the demonstration shown that the average basket price was really increased first, and secondly, on the same timing and the same period, these 11 stores, on these 11 stores, the stores that were more daylight exposed sold significantly more than the other stores. So it's another example on which you can have an indirect KPI on the impact of the daylight. Now, if we move on the residential segment, there are also some impact and some, I would say, monitoring that can be done. First, there is more and more what we call these healthy houses. We talked some time about circadian houses. Clearly, it is something on which there is still something to be more quantified. It's ongoing, I would say, but the well-being during all the season is something important, and the daylight is a part of this. Of course, there is this the second part, which is on the energy balance, or the use of energy of such a house with a lot of daylight is important to understand and to find the compromise. And this new topic, one more time in the current sanitary context, the topic of home office now becomes very important, and in this topic, daylight play an important role. I would say it is very similar to what you have, what I described before in the office building, but this is something which is quite new in residential. I did the same training a few years before, and of course I said, I'm not sure I want to be very productive at home. No, I cannot say exactly the same. I changed a little since 2 years, I would say. Some topic or some input on this residential part. Yes, this is a picture and a chart that were done from France. From all building, and it was a projection for the building over the 10 following years. So now we are in 2020, but it shows you that one of the assumptions was to say the part of the energy used to heat was very important and should decrease thanks to the improvement of the building. Probably this is what Gabriel explained you yesterday. And if you consider the lighting will not decrease in terms of demand, so the artificial lighting, I mean, of course, the part or the share of artificial lighting, energy for artificial lighting will probably increase in the building of the future. I think this chart is still valid, but probably less extreme due to the fact that today with the LED lighting, the lighting energy is probably minimized as well. But keep in mind that this is probably something on which we have to keep in account. The second point is much more on the pure daylight, I would say, impact on a residential building. So it's an individual house. And I would like to share with you this experience that is now almost 10 years old. It was done by Velux, but Saint-Gobain was also involved in this. Velux and Saint-Gobain made a house. It was in France. It was south of Paris, if I remember. And the house was done with a very high surface of window. So typically in France, there is a standard which has to have 17% of glass ratio on the floor. And the idea was to double the surface of window. And they put a family inside, so there was some occupant, real occupant, that lived inside during 1 year. And they made, of course, there was a lot of sensor to analyze the energy use, and also the feeling of the occupant. So this is what is shown here. Sorry, it is in French. But this is the perception of the family. And the first main learning was that the energy consumption even if the window and the surface of the glass of the house was double, the energy consumption was quite limited. And the family explained that they did not change anything in the way they heat the house during the winter, and they live the way of living. They didn't change anything. So it shows that even if you have a large area of window and therefore a good level of daylight in any case, it is not, I would say, contradictory with, I would say, some kind of energy saving or energy efficiency. The second learning, which is not a surprise, is of course, thanks to the large area of a window, your access to the daylight is improved. Of course, you need less electricity for lighting, but more interesting is probably the way you switch on the light on the evening, and the demonstration shown that they gain almost not 1 hour but 50 minutes of natural light during the day. More or less, they say that the family expressed first that they have a very good mood, and secondly, mainly in winter, they switch on the light 1 hour later than their neighborhood. So this is something which is quite interesting to see. You can have an access, or you can manage the better access to the daylight with all the benefit I described before, without making a compromise or degrading your energy efficiency. This is more or less what you can keep in mind on this residential experience. The last input I want to give in this introduction is today the daylight is something that is more and more market. Of course, us as a glass producer, we are marketing more and more the light. But I give an example of a French, one more time, but a French window maker, which is talking about a daylight window. Typically, their motto, they talk about a lighting window, more or less. So this is something on which more and more the marketing is taking part. So now, okay, I will give the hand to Camilla. I explain you how important is the daylight in our life. And now the question is clearly how to bring this daylight, knowing that we are a lot inside, how to bring this natural light inside the building, but with a good comfort. This is the main challenge. It's quite important the daylight is important, but we have to do it on a clever way, not going in this extreme example where there is too much sun, you have to live in a box, but not to be in the example or the drawback of overheating. So these are typically the main challenge, and what Camilla will develop in the following part. Camilla, I'll let you the end.
Yes, thank you. So I will share my screen. I see. I hear an echo. I hope it will work well. Good. So, up. So thank you, Emmanuel, for this introduction. So I will take in charge the two following parts, and then Emmanuel will finish with the last part. So,
Camilla, sorry, you are not in presentation mode. Sorry, you are in.
Sorry. So, excuse me. I shared the wrong. Thank you for your remark, Emmanuel. Okay, so now there are two more technical parts to come, but you will understand that these parts are essential to understand then how to design building with a good level of daylight. So let's go on. If it works, okay. So first, what is the light? Of course, you know the light is coming from the sun. So here on the left side of the screen, you see the yellow arrow, which represents the light coming from the sun. And a part of this light is reflected by the atmosphere. So the atmosphere is represented by the arc in darker blue. And so what is reflected, we don't consider this part. And then a part is absorbed. And what we will focus on is this major part which enters to the atmosphere. And so it is transmitted and it arrives directly on the Earth. And then there is a diffused part by the atmosphere. So as you know, in the atmosphere there are some water droplets, pollution, clouds. So by these elements, the light is also diffused. And actually, we as human beings can see this transmitted and this diffused part. Then in terms of solar spectrum, so it's the picture on the right-hand side of the screen, we represent here the solar energy against the wavelengths. And so this is some basics in the spectrometry. The wavelength area is split between the ultraviolet on the left. So this is more about so you can feel the ultraviolet through sunburns, for example. Then on the right side of the graph, you have the infrared. So this is more what represents the heat. And in the middle, you have the visible range between 375 nanometers and 700 nanometers. And if you should retain two messages, it would be that the maximum of the solar energy is in this visible range. And the second message is, if we look at the surface below the curve, so it's represented in red, almost half of this surface is in the visible range. And that means that almost half of the sun energy brings light. So to summarize, when we talk about daylight, we will focus only on the visible range and on the part of the solar energy which is transmitted and diffused by the atmosphere. So this is introduction about the light. And actually, the light coming to the room can be described by 4 components. So here, what we represent is a simulation of light in number of lux. So I will explain you what is the quantity of lux just after. But just to keep in mind that it is the quantity of light coming to a room through a window. So the window is represented by the black rectangle here. And so this light coming to the room can be split in 4 components. So the first one, what we call the direct sun, is the light which is directly transmitted by the sun that is coming to the room. Then on the top right, you can see the diffused light, so what we call direct sky. And then the 2 pictures below are the indirect light. So it's actually the reflection of the direct sun and the indirect sky, which reflects on the wall and generates additional light on the walls around. So on the picture on the left, bottom left, it's what is the reflection of the direct sun on the walls, so it's called indirect sun. And on the bottom right, it's a reflection of the direct sky on the walls, and it's what we call indirect sky. And the sum of all this gives you the total light coming to the room. So yes, so 4 parts: direct sun, direct sky, indirect sun, indirect sky, and this is what will give you the total illuminance. So talking about the illuminance, what is it? Actually, it's quantity of lux, so the unit is a lux. And it measures the amount of light which are emanating from the light source on a surface. So this is quantity, amount of light. So you have the picture describing it on the right. And then a second important metrics is luminance. So it's a little bit different. It shows how the surface is bright and how this surface is able to reflect the light coming on it. So how efficient this surface is to become an additional source of light. So you'll understand that, and you feel it, right? That the white wall will have a better luminance than a black wall, because it will be more efficient. So again, two photometry descriptors: illuminance, amount of light, and luminance, brightness of the surface. To give you an order of magnitude, here we have some typical levels of illuminance and luminance. So concerning the illuminance, in a building, the working zone will be between 100 and 1000 lux, depending on the task and the room. And concerning the luminance, so it's the second table. So it gives you the efficiency of different secondary light sources. Here we will be between 50 and 500 candela per square meters. So for example, a white paper at 500 luxes, it will have luminance around 100, and luminous ceiling will be 500 candela per square meters. Above and below, then you won't have the visual comfort. Right. So this was to give you order of magnitude, to tell you about what we talk. Then there are some factors impacting the daylight. So, and some can be obvious for you, and others a little bit maybe less, but it's important to list them all. So first, climate is an important factor that will impact the daylight. More or less direct sun or diffuse sky will give you different visual comfort. So for example, if the sky is clear, then you will get more direct sun than the direct sky, and the opposite for the overcast sky. But also the season has the importance. So you all know that in summer the sun is higher than in winter, and that means that in winter you are likely to be more exposed to direct sun, and thus to have, for example, more glare to manage. So here you see that it has an impact. Then the orientation has an influence. So that means the way the suns come inside the building. You will have more direct sun in east and west orientations. In the south orientation, maybe the sun is stronger, but it's higher. So then you won't have as much direct sun inside the room. Also the openings, and this seems obvious that the opening size and distribution will have an impact. Also the interior layout will have an impact. The color of the walls you will have in the room. Then, of course, the external environment. You imagine well that if you have a lot of trees in front of your house, in front of your windows, or if you are in a city with a lot of buildings in front of your windows, it will decrease the level of the light you will have in. And yeah, we have here a photo of a snowy with a lot of snow. So in winter time with the snow, the level of light can be very important due to snow reflection, because it's white and it reflects a lot. And then, of course, the behavior of the occupants have importance. People won't use the blinds in the same way So the blinds are very useful to manage glare inside a room, but sometimes the use of these blinds is not done in the proper way. And then if you use blinds when it's not really necessary, then you won't get enough daylight. You will increase the use of artificial lighting, so it could have impact on the energy bill, but also, as Emmanuel explained in the introduction, on the well-being and even on your health. So we saw that the factors that impact directly the light in a building, that means the 4 components we saw, the direct sun, indirect sun, direct sky, indirect sky. But actually the visual comfort is also impacted by our perception. So here in this example, you can see how a global color of a surface depends on our perception. So you probably all saw this kind of pictures. So you will have the impression then that a wall is of different color, but in fact it is the same color, but the perception we have of it is different. It depends on the surrounding colors. And this is quite important when we want to design a place with a visual comfort. Besides the metrics and what we saw before, our perception counts a lot. If you have a lot of light in the place, like on the photo on the left, the impression of the perception, a lot of impression of light in the place, you will not be visually comfortable, and it will be the same at the opposite if you have too much contrast between the colors. Right? And we already mentioned the glare, which can contribute to the visual discomfort. So glare can have various causes. It's a lot about reflections, so reflection of the bright sun or the bright sky on our computer screen. So you all know this, that it can be quite uncomfortable. The sun reflection from the neighboring buildings, if your office is in an area with a lot of big glazy facades, like for example in France La Défense. Of course, the direct view of the sun will give some glare, or also some luminance contrasts. For example, then you won't see properly what is written on your screen, etc. So the management of glare is also a way to obtain visual comfort. So this was about the basic principles of daylighting, and now we will go to even more technical part with some indicators and metrics. So yeah, it will be technical, so I hope I won't lost nobody, but you saw in the description of the task you have in the contest, there are some requirements in terms of wall to floor area, or in terms of daylight autonomy. So yeah, we need to explain you what does it mean, and I will do it in this chapter. So you can imagine that the best way to promote daylight in the buildings is through regulation and certifications. And actually more and more labels, which are mostly for non-residential, include some recommendation on daylight. So here you have the major labels, so green building labels, LEED, BREEAM, WELL, HQE, the German one DGNB. So this is the majority of them, but there are also others. And so this really talk in terms of recommendations. It's not about mandatory values, but what are the recommended values for the well-being and the visual comfort of occupants. And And of course, these labels don't talk only about visual comfort, but also about other comforts that are presented to you during these different trainings. So these are the green building labels, and there is also a new European standard on daylight in building. So it's the EN 17037, and this is really new and not well known. And I will also spend some time to explain you this new standard, but which also talks only about recommendations. Recommended levels of daylight in the building. So what are in these labels are some recommended levels in terms of illuminance, in terms of luminance, in terms of glare. So the typical values for illuminance values are for around 300, 500 lux. In offices, it will be more than in residential. Even it might a little bit change now that we work quite a lot from home. You could have also some recommendation in terms of contrast against glare, etc. And all these recommendations are, yes, the quantity of illuminance, so amount of lux, but it's always associated to a task, so such as reading, writing, working, etc. So associated to the task or to a room type in which you usually perform this task. So this is just to give you the order of magnitude. I have a little bit more order of magnitudes here in the but I won't go really into details. So we saw that for the illuminance, so the amount of light, amount of lux, we are between 100 and 1000, and then it will depend on your task on the space you are in. For example, you can imagine that in support spaces like garage, storage rooms, etc., the recommended level of illuminance will be lower than in office space where you work on on computer, or you read or you write, and you need much more light, right? So now that I talk about the labels, the recommended values, we will go to some major indicators which describe the light in the building, and the basic parameter that you will find the most often is actually the window to floor ratio, and this is typically what you have in the description of the task of in the architecture student contest. So it's the ratio of the glazed area, so ratio of the window's surface per floor surface. And sometimes in some countries it is, you have values, minimum ratio values in building codes. Sometimes these are only recommendation, and sometimes in some countries there are no recommendations at all. So you have a picture on the right for the residential sector, and you see that, for example, in France you are about 17%. So this is 1/6 of the surface. 17%. For example, in UK we talk more about 20%, but for example in Poland we are more around 12%. And this 12% is actually a European average of this window floor ratio. And what is also important to underline is that this window to floor ratio will be much more higher in non-residential buildings with big glazed facades, where we are more about 45 to 60%. But in residential, we are between 10% and 20%. These pictures on the bottom right gives you, just to give you indication what could be the result if you change the size of the windows. you see that visually you see that there is more light in this room with 30% of window floor ratio than on the left side with 12%. But the average in Europe is about this 12%. Okay, so this is the one of the first parameters which we can meet really often. And then there are two main metrics, and I put them here next to one next to the other because they are both very used, and each of them is used in the different labels. So, for example, daylight factor is used in BREEAM, HQE, or GNB green building labels, and the daylight autonomy is used in LEED and well label. So what are these metrics? Daylight factor is based on...
Camilla,
Yes?
there is question.
Yes?
About if this window floor ratio is evaluated by room or average in the building.
It's per room.
Okay.
It can also be per building. For example, in France, in the regulation in France, the 17% is in average on all the house. So it can be per room, as say Camilla, but it can also be per building. It depends on the local regulation.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't see the question.
I know. This is why I
yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
Good. And yeah, don't hesitate to ask questions. It's always more interactive. So thank you. So first, the daylight factor. So it's something which is quite easy to calculate because it's you take the light level inside of the building and the light level outside of the building, and you make the ratio. It's in overcast sky conditions, so the conditions are standardized. And so you do the ratio and you get this this first daylight factor indicator, which is so based on this measurement of illuminance outside and inside. The values will be between 2 and 5%, and it's very widely used indicator. It has some limits. I will show you these limits after, and that's why in Saint-Gobain we recommend more to use the daylight autonomy. Because daylight factors is really only geometry dependent, and the daylight autonomy it takes into account much more parameters than the daylight factor. The daylight autonomy, it takes into account the climate, the building color orientation, the time, the weather conditions over the time, etc. So what is this daylight autonomy actually? It's something that can be maybe more difficult to calculate than the daylight factor, but easier to understand actually. It's the fraction of time where a level of illuminance is reached. If you want, it's a light access you have during your daily life, every day. For example, so you need to precise the occupancy time and the illuminance threshold you use, but you can say during the occupancy time, so for example, between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., I reach 300 luxes for 50% of time. And this is the daylight autonomy, the percentage of time during which you reach the illuminance you target. So usually it's 300 lux during the day. And so, as I said, daylight factor has some limits. That's why we don't recommend to use it in Saint-Gobain, and that's why also in the student contest there is a requirement in terms of daylight autonomy and not in terms of daylight factors. So, for example, to illustrate these limits of the daylight factor, you have an example here. So you can see two rooms here. Picture simulation made in the same place, so in Paris, on March 21st at noon, intermediate sky. And so the daylight factor is the same for the two rooms. And it's only the orientation of the window which is different. And you see that your eye detects more light in the south orientation, so on the right picture, than in the north orientation. And you'll be probably more comfortable in the conditions on the right. And the daylight factors is exactly the same. So you see these limits. We have here other examples. So as I already said, the daylight autonomy depends on the latitude, but also on the orientation. So here again, we consider same daylight factor of 2%, and we calculate the daylight autonomy from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. with a target illuminance of 300 luxes in a room. And you will see that for an average orientation, in the impact of the latitude. In Southern Europe, you will have higher daylight autonomy than in Northern Europe. And another example is if you have a fixed latitude, so you're in Paris, and you have the same daylight factor, again 2%, and you change the orientation, you will see that in the south-facing window, you will get through this, thanks to this window, which is south-facing, more daylight autonomy than in if the window is north-facing. So the daylight autonomy is much more realistic than the daylight factor we want to describe daylight in the building, right? So this was daylight autonomy, daylight factors. There are other descriptors for visual comfort. I won't go through them, but it's just to tell you that there are other descriptors like useful daylight illuminance or the spatial daylight autonomy. So just for you to know, you have the definitions here. But what we use the most is the daylight autonomy and the daylight factor. And actually the spatial daylight autonomy is the daylight autonomy, but actually is the quantity of is the percentage of space for which you reach certain daylight autonomy. So it's very, very similar. Okay, and so I will finish this part with while talking about this first European norm. So I say, so it's a European standard, but actually it's more guidelines because these are only recommendations for daylight in buildings. So it describes daylight in buildings in terms of, so it gives a recommendation in terms of 4 factors. So the daylight provision, the quantity of light I will have in my room, in my building, the view out, which is also very important for the visual comfort, the exposure to sunlight, and the protection from glare. So these are parameters which are important for the visual comfort, and this norm, this standard gives you 3-level recommendation for each of these parts influencing the daylight. So it gives every time minimum recommendation, medium, and high recommendation. And actually it's a very, very ambitious standard, quite complex, quite difficult to understand. And that's why simplifications are under discussions, but I don't have, I'm not involved in this. Some of my colleagues are. So I don't know the planning, but I know that some simplifications are under discussions. And if this standard is more simplified, it will probably help to diffuse it more broadly, because for now it's not very well known yet. So first, it gives a recommendation in terms of daylight provision. So what does this standard recommend? Actually, so the best is if you look on the left picture, left part of the picture on the left. So for the facade, so if you have windows on the walls, the recommendation is to have minimum 300 lux at 50% of the surface and 100 lux at 95% of the surface during half of the daylight hours. So this is the minimum recommendation. Then you have a medium recommendation, which will be 500 lux at 50% surface and 300 lux at 95% of the surface. And then high recommendation, to recommend it recommends even higher illuminance levels. But still two values, one for the 50% of the surface and one for 95% of the surface. And it uses two calculation methods, which are location dependent. So first one is based on daylight factors and the second one on daylight autonomy. So I told you that the daylight factors isn't usually location dependent, but in this standard, as we compare the daylight factor to a target, which is location dependent, we could say that in some way we can say that this first method is location dependent, even if it's based on daylight factors. So this is for the daylight provision. Then for the view out, it recommends that we see at least, so the minimum recommendation is to have a view on a landscape, but if possible on the sky, on the landscape and on the ground. And at minimum a 6-meter view. The medium recommendation is about 20 meters view, and the high recommendation, the best of the best, is to have a more than 50 meters view with a big angle. So the angle counts also. So this is for the view out. Then there is a recommendation in terms of exposure to sunlight. So this one is quite easy to understand. It's just saying that in at least one habitable space in your building or in your apartment, you should have a minimum direct sun exposure, so minimum of 1.5 hours, and the medium 3 hours or more. And for the glare, so here I won't go into the details at all because the glare calculation is really complex. Yeah, but also it gives recommendation in terms of glare. So there, the methods to calculate the glare, to evaluate the glare, are described in the standard. So there are two methods. So we talk about daylight glare probability, simplified glare evaluation. You see the formula for the daylight glare probability. So you see it's quite complex, and so you actually do these calculations thanks to some specific softwares which will help you to calculate these values. And then if you have this value, then the standard gives you again the minimum, medium and high recommended values not to exceed. So this is about this standard. And finally, I have 2 slides to show you that Saint-Gobain also recommends some values. It's in what we call the sustainable construction by Saint-Gobain. Here again, I won't go into the details because you see there are a lot of indicators, recommended levels, etc. And I won't explain each field, but what is just important to understand is that this recommendation exists, so you can refer to this table. It's in terms of different kind of indicators, in terms of light quality, light quantity, the views, etc. And that in Saint-Gobain we make a distinction between new building and the renovation. You imagine well that if you have an existing building that you want to renovate, it's difficult to change the existing opening, the size of the existing openings or the place of the existing openings. So the idea is that in renovation, you just need to optimize these openings if you have the possibility to do this, and you can also play on the glazing specifications. And then for the new buildings, there are some recommendations in terms of daylight autonomy, etc., etc. If I remember well, in the task for the student context, there is the requirement in terms of daylight autonomy higher than 60%. So it's what Saint-Gobain Sustainable Construction recommends. And there is another table in this sustainable construction by Saint-Gobain. It's these are the same indicators, but per space, per type of room, etc. And all this, so the daylight provision indicators, so the daylight autonomy, and also the glare, can be easily assessed by some simulation tools. So many tools exist. So here, these are, I think, the most used one. I'm not an expert of this, like Diva, Dial, Radiance, etc. They are, I think, always associated to a 3D modeling tool. To model the room, the building, etc., and then to calculate for example, the daylight autonomy and the glare in the room or in the building. And just you need to understand, so that there are a lot of these tools. Each of them has different capabilities, different advantages, and then the use of these softwares will depend on your final objective of what you want to calculate. All right. So now I come to the end of these two more technical parts. So to summarize, okay, we want to reach visual comfort. We all agree with with this, and that's why we are here. So we can reach this visual comfort by playing on different parameters. So we talk about daylight availability, the daylight distribution in the room. We need to manage glare. There is the question of connection to outside and the view. So this is more linked to the well-being provided by the visual comfort. And then you have the light spectrum. That means that in the light spectrum there are several colors, and we are more sensitive to some of these colors. For example, the blue light in the light spectrum brings impacts on the physiology, and this is something. This blue light is something that can be provided only by the daylight and not by the artificial light, at least not exactly. And as Emmanuel explained at the beginning, this can influence our well-being in an indoor space. So this is about the visual comfort, and then also there is this perception of the aesthetics, which also will play in the visual comfort. So this is something that seems obvious, but it needs to be said. Yeah. So this is what I wanted to say for this more technical part about the descriptors and so on. Emmanuel?
Yeah, thank you, Camilla. I take back the hand for the last part. So now this last part is how to design building with good daylighting. I think Camilla already described a lot on this. I hope it's still working. Yes. So the Camilla already described the main parameter lever we have to optimize at least the daylight inside the different type of building. There is of course this orientation. The size of the opening is probability, and the glass ratio we already discussed before is quite important, but also the distribution, the layout interior, of course, the way to have transparent partition or not, and the color of the internal room, and the way to play with the surface inside the building. So more than having too much technical, I would say, guidelines, I would like to show you some examples that were done with some calculation tools or simulation tools or rendering tools. So this is we choose, of course, the window area because this is probably the number one in terms of impact. So here you have an example. So you have the level of luminance, if I can say, and also here, and also the some kind of rendering. So here you have an example with 10% window area with a room, and without changing the size of the room. And here you have the number of lux you have inside the room. So of course, it's everybody will understand it is not a good example. And moving to 30% or 30% window area, you see that 30%, 35% of the room area has a level above 300 lux, which is more or less a well-admit level of lux to be comfortable to work, typically to make a reading work or something like this. So this is what you have. 30%, it is more or less this red light here on the chart, and you can imagine, yes, okay, a third of the window of the room is okay, and you can grow up at 50%. So you see that in this case, it is higher, it grow higher to have this 300 lux light availability. And if you go to 75, you are almost, of course, it depends on the size of the room and how deep is the room, we will see after. But in this case, at ISO room size or room area surface, you can already reach for this dimension a good level of 300 here, and probably you start to have a lot of light very close to the window. 2000 lux is pretty high, so now you go in the direction of maybe to have too much light near the window. Second example is the impact of how the window is located inside a room. So you see here only a few windows with a very low floor area, okay, and you see, okay, we have some kind of small lighting source in the room. If you then had a window and you grow up to 30% glass ratio, if I can say, or window ratio, then you can see that you better distribute the light, and it's possible to have, I would say, a working area in a third of the room. And if you go at, let's say, higher ratio, then you can see you have a better distribution in this room, and you feel far better to make a working job in this room. Another point is how the windows are placed or are, let's say, how can I say, impacting some kind of glare issue. In fact, most of the time the discomfort is coming from some kind of important change or gradient. Here you see you have you have a very dark wall with some very clear or light area. And in this case, you can feel, maybe you do not feel it on a pure rendering picture like this, but in this case, you have the difference of light between, or color between both, can create some glare issue. So in this case, you have a level of lux which is very good, very located around the window, and the rest is very dark, and then you create a glare issue. And it's still probably true in this area, except that you have, let's say, 10% of the room with a good level of light, but still you can feel some kind of glare or discomfort. And then if you go up to 40%, of course, you increase the area with a good level of light, and this contrast, if I can say, between dark and a very light area surface is now disappearing. So this is also another impact, another perception you have to keep in mind. And finally, also this building strategy design, there is the impact of the room and the size. How deep is it? Of course, here in a very small room, if I can say, with a large glazed area, you have very high level of light, and then you can see that more you increase the size, the more you will have a surface where the level of light is below the 300, and then to here it's half of the room, which is a very deep room, where there is a lack of light, obviously. So this is increasing more and more. And the last example is how the way you are the internal, the way you manage the internal space can also have an impact. So here you see that almost it's an office example. You can see here that the almost yes, I would say 3/4 of the room is at a good level to make a working activity. If then you put more partition, obviously the size of the room did not change, and the window, the glaze area did not change, but you feel you just turn off the light, and you can increase a little by having some transparent partition inside, just to ensure that the light is coming more in the rest of the room. Okay, so here the visual comfort is a question of first the quantity of light. This is what we explain. The more window or glazed area you have, the better the better level of daylight you will have, and also the quality. It is a question to use also the natural light more than using the artificial light. But of course, during the night you have to use the artificial light, and also it's a question of keep the outside view, because it's a part of the visual comfort is the level of light, but also the view, the outside view to keep. It's a way to make the conception of a building today. You cannot avoid this outside view, this link to the external. It is absolutely true. But once you have this, I would say, building conception, you also have to consider the building envelope component, mainly to manage, I would say, the thermal comfort. So probably what Gabriel explained you yesterday, the thermal comfort, it's a way to not feel this cold or the temperature inside. And in temperature, you have the winter comfort, but also you have the summer comfort. So it's a compromise, and in this compromise, both the building conception, but also the component of the building envelope has to be chosen with the right specification to ensure that you have the good compromise between the level of light, but also a thermal comfort which is acceptable all over the year. So just to illustrate this, we develop now a product which is much more for residential area, residential application, which is a very transparent glass, which is highly insulative, but also extremely transparent. And this gives you an advantage. You do not degrade the energy performance of the building using this kind of glass. But as Camilla explained, it's a way, we measure it, to gain a few points of daylight autonomy just by changing the glass, without changing the size of the window, the size of the glazed area. It's just an impact of the pure piece of glass, giving a compromise between energy saving, but also without any compromise on the daylight autonomy. And the last point is, of course, this overheating or summer comfort that has to be taken in account. Very often, I took a very provocative picture, probably, but this is an example of what happens when it is very hot during the summer period. The best way to protect yourself is to close the shading, so you lose the outside view. Most of the time, you can use also some very nice air conditioning, so you can see the ugly installation you can have. Boy, I understand it's very provocative, but at the end, you live in the dark, you don't have any connection to exterior, and very often, if you use this very, I would say, this air conditioning on a, how can I say, it's an installation which is not how can I say, well done or very punctual. Your window is open at the end, so you have you increase the noise and the energy consumption issue. So and today there exists some glass also, glass product that can give you the compromise. You keep the light, you keep the external view, but it's possible also to protect against the heat sun for very, I would say, warm climate and or during warm period. So this is not incompatible. And last example is the dynamic glass. Maybe it's the very last evolution, but it exists today. This is what Sage Glass is doing. You have the possibility to dark the glass on a control way, on a dynamic way, but a control way. And then it's a way to manage to keep, in any case, the external view to keep a certain level, the right level of light, without having it's an alternative to the shading management in some very extreme exposure to the sun. So it's a glare management, it's an external view optimization, and in some extent also an overheating management as well. So it's the very last I would say installation you can have for the glass point of view. So I think that's it. If you have any questions, so I did not see any more questions on the chat, but I hope there is still some minutes to answer to your question if you have. So do not hesitate. I come back in a more sympathetic view. So it was crystal clear in the way to present, or maybe too much information. So of course we are able to. You will probably have the presentation, and it will be available. I think Eric, you say yes. There are very. We can also provide, if you need some additional, I would say, reference on what we present. We can give you this in addition. Of course, we have this available.
It was very clear. Thank you very much, Emmanuel and Camilla. for the theoretical part, but also for the illustration at the end. And I'm sure it will help and support all the students for the contest.
I hope so.
And anyway, we'll share the replay on YouTube channel again and on the student contest website. Thank you very much to all of you, and see you at 2 p.m. To attend to the training on acoustic comfort. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
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 Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.